So thanks to all for coming here. In typical Latin American fashion, Tom was supposed to give the talk, but he defaulted, and so I'm going to be the imperfect substitute. So let me begin narrating the story behind this paper, or the motivation behind this paper, by giving you a personal story of a motivation that has to do with years when I was growing up in the 80s. I was born actually in the middle of this timeline, right exactly in the middle of this timeline, between the transition between a military junta and Belaunde. I grew up in Lima, in Peru, to what would be considered an upper middle class family. And despite being part of the middle upper class, when I was growing up, I faced economic constraints, such as not having water. These are things that are going to sound familiar to Marco or Cesar, who are also Peruvian. There's no energy. Oftentimes blackouts. My parents had to wait, several years to get a telephone line, several years to get a car. I remember that my dad would show up at home with, stacks of bills, like literally this size. And when I was like 8 or 9, I thought, wow, my dad must be a very wealthy guy. But actually, they weren't worth much. So these outcomes were actually the result of really bad policies that came earlier on. So in 1967, there was a military coup in Peru led by General Velasco. And Velasco was very influenced by a very influential writer from South America, or from Peru in particular, which is Mariátegui. He was a communist. He was the leader of the communist movement in Peru in the early 20s. And so Velasco adopted many of the ideas that were, written in Mariátegui, and when he took over power, he essentially nationalized major industries. He nationalized banks. He nationalized, fish industry, mines, and he carried out a huge agrarian reform, which essentially divided land, to different peasants and so on. And he also carried out massive social programs, right? That eventually ended up in reflecting onto deficits. And then years after, Velasco was about to die in 1976. He was replaced by another military junta with a right-wing inclination, but nothing really changed in terms of deficits. So then Peru transitioned back to democracy in 1980, 1981, with a government led by Belaunde. And then, stories continued where fiscal deficits were key characteristic of government policies. Most of these were financed with via seigniorage. And then when we reached the years of Alan Garcia, Peru ends up being in a terrible situation. Seigniorage had been, taken, I guess, to a limit. We end up with 8,000% inflation by the final years. Because the government didn't have any revenues to service its debt, it defaulted on external debt, and so on. So what were the balance of those decades and the balance of the decades after? So these pictures are showing you essentially fiscal surpluses in Peru. You see the volatility there is something that really strikes me. If you look at for primary deficits, when you look at overall deficits, we don't have data for prior to Alan Garcia, but overall deficits accounted for 7-8% of overall GDP. When we compute essentially the year where I was born, you see a decline of GDP of you started at an index of around 150, you would end up essentially with 30% less at a value of 100. And so then in 1990, Fujimori wins the elections again, and he proposes a system or a program of reforms that dramatically changed the face of the country. So I'm going to detail what reforms he carried out, but the balance of those reforms were, I would say, positive. Since 1990, Peru has grown almost continuously. its fiscal deficits have been put on check. Inflation has been dragged down to decent levels, 2%, 3%. And this has been a continuous path ever since. Foreign external debt has been drawn down to levels of, foreign public debt has been dragged down to levels of 10% and so on. So in my view, has been an extremely positive balance. And so has this success been luck? Has it been purely, the outcome of, just having a lucky decision on precedent and so on? This is a big question for me because, ever since I have any form of recollection, every single time a government has been elected, either me or my parents have been freaking out because we think in every single election we think, we are back to the past. But it turns out that these reforms and these institutions that were put in place by Fujimori, despite what governors say, remain there. So if we look at Chile, I would say that somebody who was born in the 70s could tell a very similar story to the one I'm narrating, except that we need to change the names of the key figures. And Chile itself has its own populist, not a dictator, but a democratically elected populist who was Allende. And Allende also carried out a system of reforms by which he nationalized key industries. He expanded entitlements in the Chilean economy. He raised minimum wages and carried out systematic deficits up to the point that by the end of his government in 1973, fiscal deficits amounted to roughly 12% of GDP, despite that revenues had increased 17%. So you're talking about increases in government expenditures of above 30%. And of course, like in other countries, when Chile did not have the tax revenue base to implement those social programs, Chile nationalized its industries, or declared a moratorium on its debt, or resorted to inflation or senior-ash financing, which ended up showing up in inflation. And as an outcome, you saw a rapid decline in GDP growth per capita during Allende's years. But then came Pinochet and adopted a series of reforms, very much like in the vein of the ones that would be adopted later on in Peru. And we see a very similar outcome also in Chile. So GDP growing, not stably, because Chile adopted a peg in the late 70s, which cost which in combination with a banking crisis caused a reduction in GDP. But after that, it has shown a stable path for GDP growth. And something very similar is going on for inflation. Public debt, foreign public debt in Chile went up. That's true because it absorbed part of the debt issued by banks to the external sector. So that's why you see this increment in foreign public debt. But then ever since, the debt has been declining, and Chile is known as a success story. And if I were to show you the similar picture for Argentina, you would also see a very unstable pre-reform era with large fiscal deficits in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Inflation, several inflation episodes pre-reform. They had a reform in 1991 with Menem. And then when you look at GDP growth, again, Argentina's experience has been positive in terms of GDP growth. It's not been as stable as Peru or Chile. It had a severe decline in 2001 when it left the convertibility. But it has been growing constantly since. And you could say from the outset, if you look simply at these pictures, that Argentina could be considered also a success story, but not quite. So that's going to be the point of the paper. So what we try to say in this paper is that all these three countries have remarkably similar histories. They all started, in the 50s and 70s, or from the 50s to the 70s with some form of classic Latin American populism, which nationalized state enterprises, which expanded Social Security, which expanded entitlements, which increased government expenditure substantially. Most of these increments in spending were translated into deficits that were eventually financed via monetization of deficits. And then all these countries experienced some form of hyperinflation, some form of international default, some form of expropriation, and eventually sharp GDP declines. After the severe economic crisis, all of these countries are, feature violent transitions. So Pinochet takes over, in Chile, essentially bombarding the House of the Executive. Violent transition also in Peru, and a very violent transition also in Argentina. Then, after these violent transitions, all of these three countries adopt very similar reforms. The pioneer of these reforms was Pinochet, but they all have a very similar pattern. First, they all three adopt new constitutions. Part of the goal of those constitutions is to, implement reforms that would enforce some form of fiscal discipline. They carry out large privatization programs that essentially privatized, state enterprises. They privatized, all three of them privatized their social security systems that were, substantially showing deficits in their self-funding. And they all grant central bank independence. And these are the reforms that we're going to focus on today. And they also adopt other types of reforms that we're not going to talk about. Right? Essentially, all these countries, while they were experiencing inflation, had some form of price controls. They had some form of minimum wages, very strict form of minimum wages. They all used tariffs in systems that were highly distorted. So despite these similarities, Argentina is somewhat different. And it's different for the reason that I'm going to show you in this timeline. So this is a little bit of Argentina's recent history. So Carlos Menem becomes president in 1990 in Argentina. Right? Argentina at that time was experiencing, again, a period of high inflation. And then, together with his finance minister, Domingo Cavallo, they designed a system of convertibility. Essentially, they pegged the peso to the dollar with the idea in mind that would, contribute to setting up credibility for the central bank. And in a similar vein to what would happen in Peru and what happened earlier in Chile, and as a key instrument to implement central bank credibility, Argentina also privatized many of its state-owned enterprises that were nationalized a couple of decades ago. And this was a key instrument to control inflation because it was a quick source of government revenues that allowed government not to resort to senior-ass funding. A couple of years after, 1994, Argentina adopts an entirely new constitution, and in addition to that, it reforms entirely its pension system. Back in a couple of years later, in 1997, the national government negotiates with some pension, with the provincial government, and absorbs also the provincial pension system. A couple of years later, Argentina, the late 90s, is severely affected by an international crisis. The exchange rate doesn't help them. There's a strong devaluation in Brazil, and Argentina starts experimenting again high fiscal deficit, and eventually it loses reserves to a point that it could not sustain the peg for those years. So there's a very important there's a devaluation and default in 2001. And then, in the middle of the crisis, the central bank reform is reversed partially. So the the first central bank reform essentially prohibited any type of lending from the central bank to the national government, to the federal government. But post default or devaluation, as the government doesn't have enough resources, they reversed partially the reform of central bank independence, and they changed zero borrowing to some borrowing limits from the central bank to the national government. Then the first, Kirchner takes over the presidency, and then in 2006, he carries out a program of repatriation of debt. So essentially what he does is he says, look, we have all this external debt with the IMF. We're going to pay back debt with the IMF and issue debt domestically. It turns out that the pensions in Argentina cannot invest freely. The portfolio allocations are constrained by law. So one of the portfolio constraints is, requires them to hold enough, government debt, safe government debt. So it was in some sense some form of nationalization of debt or expropriation of that debt through this repatriation of debt from the IMF to the pension system. A couple of years after, so Argentina had this reform on the pension system that I will detail. It entirely reversed the reform by saying, the private portion of the pension system is now going to be nationalized. And now in recent years, last few years, it's nationalized the national airline company, it's nationalized its petroleum company, and it's almost entirely reversed its central bank independence reforms. Some picture that shows some of the outcomes that we are already seeing in Argentina is this one that I like a lot. This is computed by Cavallo's son, and this picture is showing two inflation indexes. One is the official inflation index, which is here in blue, and in orange, this is an internet-based inflation index for Argentina. And we see two things: inflation in Argentina is speeding up, and two, at a much higher pace than what the official figures show. When I show if I were to show you exact same picture for the United States, the two time series would track each other. So what we do in this paper is we begin with a story essentially narrating the recent economic histories of all these three countries. And then as a second step to try to answer why Argentina is different, why it reversed its reforms, and why were they sustained in Peru and in Chile, we try to review some descriptive work or historical work done at the time that focused on the details or institutional details of these reforms in all these three countries. This is outside the realms of Tom's research and mine. I'm used to working with models, and my comfort zone usually comes when I finish the introduction. I start talking about models. There's nothing like that here. And I thought when we started writing this project that it would have been much easier than a project where you have to write a model and study a model and so on. It turns out that it's extremely hard to figure out what details we have to pick up to focus on the differences. But to some extent, it's a very useful exercise because there's a lot of information that we perhaps cannot capture simply in statistics. There's a lot of details on about institutions that are very important and that we may learn a lot from, and so that's what the paper is about. And the contribution is essentially to study the histories of these countries, to study the, this narrative of how these reforms were carried out, what were the political clashes that were going on at the time, and the contribution is to employ economic theory to try to tease out what are the key differences among these countries. And we want to answer why Argentina is different. And we're going to postulate something which is very simple. We're going to postulate that the key origin behind these reversals has to do with a very simple fact that Argentina was never capable of resolving the political economy problems that lead it to experience these fiscal deficits. And this is a common theme in Tom's recent work and past work. Something very similar to what goes on in other countries. So to summarize the history, I'm not going to go into more details about the histories of these countries, but I think we can summarize these histories in three quotations. So the first one attributed to Eva Perón, captures the populism era of the 50s through 70s. So she said, keeping books and social aid is capitalistic nonsense. I just use the money for the poor. I can't stop to count it. It turns out that it's very hard for us to get data from the 50s and 70s for Argentina at the time. The second quote captures the violent transitions that occurred right after these populism era and the eras of crisis. So this is taken from Salvador Allende's final words. So he says, placed in a historic transition, I will pay for the loyalty to the people with my life. He was bombarded by Pinochet's military in a very emblematic way. He was bombarded by F-14 jets, and he shot himself with an AK-47, which was given to him as a gift by Fidel Castro, actually, that day. And then the final quote is taken from a speech that is given by Fujimori when he essentially had a coup on his own Congress. It epitomizes the pragmatic nature of the reforms that were carried out in all three countries. So he says, my government's policies have been described as liberal or free market by certain individuals who like to label reality. I am sorry, but you have the wrong label. My government and I are simply pragmatic. This means that I do not pay homage to theories, dogmas, or myths. I'm an agronomist, which is true, he was an agronomist. But I do not breed cows, and I do not believe in sacred cows. Yet he carried out very similar reforms to other countries. So let's start with the differences and what made these countries differences. And so, for one thing, to start with, we need to look at who the reformers were. And in the case of Chile, it was a dictator, Pinochet, who essentially faced virtually no opposition when he carried out these reforms. Everything was almost handpicked. And Peru had a very similar situation in the following sense. So Peru was crippled by a Maoist insurgent group. So when I grew up, we were all used to hearing bombs in different parts of the city. We would see articles in the newspaper about such and such person being murdered. One of the parents of one of my closest friends was actually murdered. He was the president of the National Milk Company. And people there were very, very upset, and it was very frustrating. And so Fujimori carried out a sequence of actions that make him a very popular figure and gave him some entitlements and some popularity that otherwise he wouldn't have gotten. Thanks for tackling down on terrorism. And so in 1991, when he tries to pass out some reforms on the pension system, which was dragging down its fiscal accounts, or try to privatize state-owned enterprises, which were a main cost for fiscal deficits, Fujimori faces a very strong opposition from Congress, and essentially, again, unites with the military and shuts down Congress. So Fujimori does not face a strong opposition at all after the shutting down Congress. He would, call for new elections and essentially try to pass a new constitution, but it was a much more favorable Congress back then. Pinochet did not have any opposition whatsoever. And Argentina has been a very different story. So the key reformer, again, in Argentina is Menem. But Menem had a difference between with these two guys. So Menem did have to negotiate approvals with Congress. And in particular, and this is something that is not written down and is not hard evidence, but it's something that we read or we find out as we read in many articles, he had to negotiate with key players in Argentina's politics. And these key players are provincial governors. And so we need to understand a little bit better what the political institutions in Argentina are to continue making progress on this question. Just to give you an idea of the opposition faced in Chile, this is a picture showing you strikes in Chile. And so when you see that there were a large number of strikes up until 1973 when Pinochet takes over. And essentially, after he takes over, there's essentially no strikes going on in Argentina, no, days of work stopped and so on. And a similar picture you would find if you look at Peru's figures. So one basic difference has to do with the electoral rules in all these three countries. So in 1989, Chile approves a constitution which was essentially written by Pinochet's government, and it has been designed in a way that is it's been designed in a way that tries to foster coalition formation. So the way it works in Chile is that Chile has X number of electoral districts, and each electoral district will have 2 slots for a position at the Senate. Now, something that you find in the literature is that when you have systems with that structure, that fosters coalition formation. Because if you have many parties that have, and that's been the outcome in Chile, that have formed essentially 2 big parties, it's very costly to deviate if you belong to one of those parties, because there's no way you can make a spot in the Senate by just simply attracting a smaller proportion of votes. And it also promotes new parties to join in former coalitions. So it's essentially a very similar structure modeled on the basis of the US system. There's no local governments in Chile, essentially by election. So essentially once the president is elected, the president appoints the heads of local governments. And then municipal elections are carried out exactly the same day as presidential elections. So the probability that municipalities end up on the same party as the president-elect are higher. In Peru, electoral rules do not foster coalition formation like in Chile. In particular, there's multiple districts, and districts find seats in Congress in proportion to their populations. So regions find seats in Congress in proportion to their populations. And in particular, Peru is a country where multiple parties coexist, and multiple parties are associated with particular figures. So they don't survive the political careers of their party leaders. There's essentially one traditional party, which is APRA, which is Alan Garcia's party. And regional governments exist and are assigned by elections, but they are essentially irrelevant for any type of, to have any influence on budget deficits. First of all, they have very low budgets, and they have very low participation, and the only budgets they have actually are obtained from natural resources that are extracted from their own regions. But if those regional governments want to invest those funds, they face limits by national technical offices in Lima, in the capital. So Argentina had also a new constitution enacted in 1994, but it kept its strong regional federalism. So there's multiple national governments in Argentina, and each national government has its own constitution and its own Congress, and they are in charge of a very large fraction of spending. These regions are called provinces, and moreover, and this is taken from a paper by Spiller and Tomasi, they have been key players in determining the interactions between the executive and Congress. So the way this works is essentially in the following format. So the heads of different provinces have a very strong, or have a lot of power in electing who the congressman for that province will be. and typically they fund the campaigns of those provincial congressmen. And because they fund the campaigns of these provincial congressmen, indirectly, they have an influence on the interactions between the executive and Congress. Provinces can issue debt, and that's something very similar, very different from what happens in Peru or Chile. And this has been used as a bargaining instrument because, for example, many of these provinces have accumulated pension deficits, which eventually were taken over by the federal government. So this is a decomposition of income and expenditures in Argentina. So the national government collects 55% of taxes for its own use, and in addition, an 18% of taxes from the different provinces, which it puts in a common pool. And then provincial expenditures, although they only account directly for 13% of tax revenues, although this extra 18% comes from different provinces, provincial expenditures account for 37% of expenditures. They are in charge of health expenditures and education expenditures. And within the national budget, there's very small space for decisions other than portions of the budget deficit that are not stuck. So, for example, 34% of the national expenses are associated with transfers. 34% are associated with funding the pension system deficit. 13% are payroll, and then the extra 11% are debt. The remainder of this number, which doesn't add up to 100, are the entries where the government has some discretionary power. The federal government has some discretionary power. So we can break the timing or the method in which budgets are proposed and carried out in 3 steps. So essentially, the proposal, the execution, and something which is the performance balance. So in Chile, all of the proposals, all of the initiatives for budget deficits are on the hands of the executive. So the finance ministry essentially meets together with the presidency and designs a sequence of budgets for all the different agencies and all the different ministries in Chile. And Congress has a very passive role. It essentially can only look at different entries of that budget, and of every entry, it can only propose reductions. It cannot make any decisions or any proposals on changing the allocations among those entries or increase the budget of any of those individual entries. So it can only propose reductions in the entries of those different agencies. And in particular, it has a very short period of acceptance. So it has to accept the budget in between 30 or 60 days. And if it's not accepted, then essentially it's approved. And in particular, Chile has had some explicit fiscal rules that bind the growth of budgets in recent years. In Peru, the story is not so clear. So the executive essentially also proposes a budget, but the key player is the finance ministry. So the finance ministry is the agency that negotiates the budgets with different agencies and other ministries, and it also has some short approval period, but there is more space for interactions with Congress. In particular, Congress can amend some of the entries, and in particular, it is allowed to make some entries to the budget. Argentina is again different. So nominally, it has a very strong Congress, but as I said earlier, according to some of the readings that we're doing, de facto, it has a very weak Congress, and really what happens is negotiations between provincial governments and the executive. So This is very tricky because it's not part of a formal institution, so there's no particular law that we can read onto and say, well, the law is actually saying this, and these are the formalisms behind that law. So as I said earlier, the mechanism is essentially a political mechanism by which provincial governors propel the careers of different congressmen, and since these congressmen have a very short-lived political career, then there's no reputation to gain. So, there's a lot of claims that these are political instruments. Yet on the other hand, in Argentina there's another problem, which is what the executive does after budgets are approved by Congress and after they've negotiated with the different regions. So there's three problems that we've found in many of these papers. The first is that in order to approve budgets, the national government has to make projections for revenues and expenses. And typically, it's always been under-projecting the revenues. The reason being that in Argentinian law, if there's any excess of revenues found in a particular year, the entity that has discretion over those sources is the federal government, the national government. So the national government has, in every year, except for the years in which Argentina was negotiating its debt refinance with the IMF, when it had incentives to overestimate budget revenues, in every single year, outside those years of 2002 and 2003, it's under-predicted revenues. In addition to that, the federal government has the power to administer a quota system. So once budgets have been approved, the allocation is part of that approval. But yet the timing of when the funds are delivered to the different provinces may be in part discretionary for the federal government. So it can play with when it delivers those transfers to provincial governments, also as an instrument of political coercion. And finally, something that is common in Argentina, but also in Chile and Peru, is the use of decretos ley. Decretos ley are last-minute laws that are entitled by the federal government so that it can, draw on some expenses. And so once at the earlier part of the execution of budgets, when budgets are proposed, provincial governments have all this negotiation, but going on with the federal government. But ex ante, they have all the incentives to press for higher allocations because for all these three reasons, perhaps the national government doesn't have the ability to make credible commitments. So checks and balances in Chile, there's agencies that expose, verify that budgets were respected. In the case of Argentina, there's two institutions, one that is controlled by the executive, and the other one which is controlled by Congress, but it's also been used as a bargaining tool by provinces. The committees in Congress that are supposed to meet and interact with the agency from Congress have met once in 20 years. And so then we look at differences in Social Security, for example. And Social Security had a very similar story, again, in all these three countries. So what I found interesting in the histories of these countries is that Social Security emerged in all three of them union by union. So say in the case of Argentina, for example, the first form of Social Security that we find are essentially Social Security and pensions for railroad workers in 1915. And little by little, different unions or different groups of blue-collar and white-collar workers pressed national governments in exchange for votes for some form of pension. And it's very similar in all three countries. And then by the 70s, all three of them have a very messy pension system, and they decide to, reform their pensions in a way that would have like a common theme, same agency. Everything would be centralized, and that's the histories of these pension system. But they all ended up, generating a fiscal burden, because many of these pension programs were used as a political tool and used for entitlements for political leverage. And something which is particularly interesting is that during the 80s, when you had high inflation, and you have the classical Tansi-Bresciani-Turoni effect, where basically the government spends some amount of resources and then collects taxes in January, but then is able to spend those resources collected in January only by June. When you have a certain amount of inflation, that means that your inflation base has been eroded. When you had inflation in these countries during the 80s, individuals that were contributing to the pension system would also strategically delay their payments and be late on their payments to the Social Security office in a way that would erode also the revenues for these offices. So all this led to a need to reform of these funds. So in all three countries, you see a privatization of Social Security, but they come in different flavors. So in Chile, for example, the reform of Social Security comes in Pinochet's natural authoritarian form, which was, he essentially said, all new entrants to the pension system, all new workers are going to be part of a private system. This private system is going to be managed by private companies, and they transitioned from a pay-as-you-go system to a self-entitlement system, so an individual account system. And at an initial point in time, where the reforms were carried out, not everyone, and so old workers could choose whether to go to the private system or not, but not everybody joined the private system. In fact, the minority of workers that had the national system joined the private system. So Pinochet offered certain incentives, and then by the end, in 1999, 96% of the population in Chile's pensions are managed by private accounts. Something very similar was carried out in Peru, so people could choose between joining a private system or a public system, or keep themselves in the national system. And so again, it was a failure at the very beginning, but then later on, the government provided the right incentives so that people joined the private system as well. And then 76% of individuals are part of the private system in Peru. Argentina was a little bit different because it's not that people could join a private fund or a national fund. It was carried out differently. In Argentina, if you have a pension, part of your pensions, up to a certain limit, will be managed by the national pension system, and all of the excess is managed by private accounts. So up to a limit, your accounts are managed by the national authority of which has a pay-as-you-go system, and then all of the excess, you get to choose whether you have a private account, which is essentially self-financed, or whether you want to be part of an excess that is pay-as-you-go. So, one of the things that went on, which I already mentioned, is these limits on portfolio investment, which has also been common in Peru and in Chile. So when we look at the fiscal burden, this is taken by a paper from Centragolo and Jimenez. We look at the fact that the fiscal burden in Argentina has been quite large. So it's been accumulated. If you start in 1987, essentially all of the funding of the payouts of the pension system were funded internally by pensions themselves of older workers. But as time has gone by, there's been a bigger and bigger gap between the funding that is coming from the collections of the fund itself and the total payouts that the pension system had to make out. So up to the point where the deficit was actually 3% of GDP in 2001. So a pension in Argentina by that time would guarantee something about 75% of the average wage of the average pensioner. but the fund had enough resources to fund only 30%. So privatizations also, had a common theme. It was argued that privatizations were going to be carried out for efficiency reasons. We don't think that's true. We think that privatizations were carried out precisely in times where the government needed a rapid form of resource extraction, so that it could stop its inflation episodes. Otherwise, there was no way to operate the government without any taxes that were not coming from money printing. So, for example, in Argentina, the average privatization revenues per year was roughly about 1% of GDP. So this is an example of what government state enterprises were doing in these countries. So this is a picture from Peru, and this is showing you the overall balance of state-owned enterprises. So one way to think about state-owned enterprises is that, whenever these governments wanted more resources, they nationalized these companies. After a couple of decades, these companies were managed so poorly that they were generating large deficits. So in the case of Peru here, you see that in certain years, the balance of all nationalized companies was negative 5% of GDP. And in part, this was due to a system of distortions where nationalized companies were being used to, say, the oil company would sell gasoline at a lower price than its cost. So when they needed revenues again, they privatized these companies again. So so our story is, fiscal. These companies were privatized for fiscal reasons. And then when we talk about monetary independence, we really don't have to say much. We can quote Christina Kirchner here. So again, the legal structure of the Argentinian Central Bank has been modified in 2012. So they've expanded the limits of central bank lending to the federal government. And she says, I believe we should put a final end to the convertibility. This is essentially 11 years after. To the convertibility plan with a central bank that is not limited to preserve monetary stability, but that also preserves fiscal and production stability. A central bank that interacts with the real economy is what we need. So I don't think we have to say much. I mean, we're all economists in this room. Tom and company have illustrated the risk of, funding deficits with seigniorage. This is a very risky or fragile game where beliefs can switch rapidly, and you can face high periods of inflation. Beliefs can change rapidly. And this is a picture taken from the newspaper in Argentina yesterday, where we'll see some protests against it, particularly about the inflation. People are protesting against the high inflation rate. Again, the official and the unofficial numbers don't match. And so, in conclusion, one way to think about this paper is to think of a pecking order of populism. So, when governments did not have enough resources, they've either extracted resources from foreign lenders, so they expropriated foreign lenders, and when they ran out of those resources, they nationalized companies, so they extracted resources from domestic agents. And when they ran out of those resources, they actually nationalized their pension systems in one way or the other. And when they ran out of those resources, they nationalized everyone by using inflation. So there's a pecking order of these, nationalizations or expropriations, which may also expect or explain some form of pecking order for the reversals of these reforms. But as these revenue sources continue to disappear, and you continue to introduce distortions, then they may lead to potential social unrest. And I hope we don't see that cycle in Peru, and it seems that we're seeing it in Argentina.
Thanks a lot for the invitation to discuss the paper. I got an email from Tom and Saki a few days ago telling me the paper might not be ready on time and that I better prepare and talk about the topic in general, but with my own views. Which my first reaction was of panic. like, okay, I need to figure out everything that is not, I need to know about Argentina, Peru, and Chile. My second reaction was, well, this might be the easiest discussion I ever made, except for the fact that I had to take a plane very early in the morning. So what I'm going to do today is I more or less understood the main topic of the presentation, and I was going to just discuss within the simple model what I think is, in my mind, a very interesting question that is being raised by the paper. So I think the overall story here is that these countries look similar in the fact that they share a common history of populism. So they had the usual mix of expropriation, nationalizations, and subsequent high inflation and debt crisis. All eventually implemented similar reforms, privatized enterprises, social security system, they gave independence to the central bank, and implemented fiscal rules. And reforms were initially successful in all of these countries, and they have been maintained in Chile and Peru, but they seem to be going a period of reversion in Argentina. Yeah, and that's kind of the bottom line of the paper. And then there's an investigation of, what happened in Argentina versus Peru and Chile that led to that reversion. So I think a question that comes out of this paper is basically, what constitutes a successful and also a sustainable reform. So what makes a reform last for a long time? And I wanted to frame it, even though Saki said they didn't have a model, I wanted to write down a little model and kind of think about the issues there. And I'm going to discuss an example where we can talk about what is a successful reform and what is a temporary reform. And something I would like to highlight is to discuss that there are reforms that can change the state variable. In this case, the amount of debt on how much the government owes, and those reforms will have temporary effects on the economy. But there are other effects, other reforms that may change the underlying driving forces, which I think is a point that is emphasized in the discussion, the political economy that led to those sustained high deficits of the government. And the distinguishing between these two is actually an avenue to think about whether the reform will last or is just temporary. Okay. So let me tell you the way I'm going to think about it is. The authors discuss in the paper the issue of reputation of a small open economy, the fact that and the interaction between debt and the policies that the government chooses. So I'm going to write down a very simple model. It's a small open economy model which has an interest rate R, which is less than the international interest rate. It faces an interest rate of R, which is less than the discount factor, meaning a bit impatient. We like to borrow from abroad. They have domestic firms that use output. They use factors, capital and labor. I'm going to assume labor is exogenous. The economy have governments, and I'm going to talk about governments in a little bit. But they're not the usual representative agent. They're actually subject to political disagreements. And there's going to be this parameter throughout the model, which I'm going to call theta, which is actually represents the degree of disagreement. And a higher theta will mean more disagreement. A lower theta means less disagreement. We can write down taxes and a kind of complicated problem here. I don't have time to go through that, so I'm going to jump directly to the primal problem that comes out. Okay. So the way I'm going to think about this is by this sequence problem, where I'm going to think of the political problem as choosing allocations of government expenditures, G, and capital investment efficiency, if you wanted, K. Okay? And the way those things work is basically I'm going to look at the ones that maximize the utility of representative agent, if you wish. Okay? It's going to be linear to make it simple. Okay? It's going to be a representative agent in this country who looking for the plans, the fiscal plans that an investment that maximizes their utility. That's the maximization there, where beta is the discount factor. Subject to what? Well, subject to budget constraint for this government, which is the fact that they can use capital for production. F, they have to pay the opportunity cost of capital. That's the R plus delta K. R is the interest rate, delta depreciation, and they also consume the G. Okay, and whatever is left of that resources of the economy, that has to go back to payments of debt holders. Okay, so that's the initial, that's kind of the budget constraint written as a time zero problem, as of time zero. There is also what I'm going to call a sustainability constraint. I think something that Tom and Saki emphasize, that future governments need to go along with this. Okay, they need to be willing to actually follow that plan that we're choosing here. So the way I'm going to think about it is that I'm going to define the utility of future governments in a similar way to the utility of the representative agent. And I'm going to be checking that the future governments want to go along, so they're checking their utility that they get in this plan versus some deviation value that they will get otherwise. And that deviation value, you can think about is the value saying, I'm not going to follow this plan that you propose, I'm going to default, I'm going to expropriate, I'm going to do a bunch of mean things to you. I'm going to just summarize all that by the state of the economy, which is just the capital stock. And the only thing I need to actually assume in this discussion is that this function is increasing in K. Okay? Now, going back to the sustainability constraint, you're going to see it's a bit different from the standard thing. So this is not a representative agent, but it's a government that is in principle trading off these util flows that are generated by the government expenditures in a different way from the population. Okay? And the only thing that I'm adding is this parameter theta, which is bigger than 1, and it just says that it's a summary, if you want to wish, that if you are in power today as a government, you get a higher kick when spending happens today versus spending that may happen in the future. Okay? So from the future on, I look like a standard agent, but today I know I'm in power, so I'm going to spend a little bit more. And the political disagreement then is just going to be this parameter theta that may move around. Okay? Maybe bigger than 1, close to 1 will be the standard, higher numbers mean more disagreement about parties, which implies more desire to spend when you have control. Because if you give it up, the disagreement will generate other parties in the future doing something that you may not want those resources to go to. Okay? All right, so that's a simple problem. I can just gonna introduce a multiplier on this constraint, lambda, which is gonna tell you how that constraint binds. And what you can see from here is that, if this constraint weren't around, this economy, even though it's impatient or whatever, it doesn't have a need to distort income, investment. There's no reason to create an inefficient economy just because you are impatient. So f prime of k should be equal to r plus delta. Okay, now the fact that you need to keep track of this constraint introduces a multiplier. I'm going to keep track of that multiplier. The bigger that multiplier is, the more distortions there are. Okay, so lambda is going to be the multiplier of that constraint, and the only thing I want you to think about is that higher values of that multiplier means more distortion, which in this model imply lower capital. Turns out, though, that there is a very simple solution in this linear model to this problem where the multiplier follows a linear rule. Okay, that multiplier on that constraint. Basically, I'm plotting here the multiplier at time t versus the multiplier at time t plus 1. And there is a linear rule, this black solid line here, where the theta parameter actually enters there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that theta is. There's going to be a steady state, a unique one, with a particular distortion in this economy, lambda infinity, which is going to be positive and implies that this economy is going to be distorted in a steady state because politicians cannot commit not to tax and expropriate the capital that is in place. Okay? And the dynamics are actually kind of straightforward. If you move to the right here, or up, means more distortion, also means higher debt. Actually, I'm going to talk a bit about that in a second. Those figures that Saki showed at the beginning of the debt accumulation by these countries is actually part of the point here. More debt, more distortions. And the dynamics just kind of use the usual thing. You start at a particular value and then just approach that steady state. So this is a case where economy started with, say, very little debt, have not a lot of distortions, the lambda was small. Over time, he actually accumulated debt and choose to accumulate debt, their governments, and at the same time generated bigger and bigger distortions in the economy. So So just what's going on here, basically there is a frontier between debt and investment in this model. This is more or less what's going on. So a government cannot do both. It cannot have more debt and more investment at the same time. It's just cannot happen. There is a frontier. And it has to be choosing between these two. If it decides to accumulate debt, that makes it, that is like I think about, usually talk about, when you talk about Marx about this, it's like a starving dog. You know, he's hungry, so obviously if he sees a very nice firm out there, he's going to try to grab it. So a starving government who has a lot of debt cannot commit not to expropriate and inflate. Just very hard for it. So, and over long periods of time, actually this is consistent with evidence that we have seen in the cross-section of emerging markets that sovereign debt accumulation is associated with shrinking economies. So what is a temporary reform in this war, actually? Suppose that Saki and Tom emphasize this idea that there are these assets that were somewhat illiquid, we call it stand-on enterprises, and suddenly they became, you could sell them, and that became a source of revenue, and that created a lift, okay? So you can think of that as something that relaxes the budget constraint, that changes the amount of debt really owed by this government. You think of the debt as being the net between the liquid positions of these governments, and that would be something that does this. So it pushes you back. So you have an effect. You are less indebted. The economy is more relaxed. You have more investment, so lambda is lower. But that's it. You're going to go back. Now, it turns out that the process at which, the speed at which you go back, actually, this could be, in this simple model, could be, I can make it arbitrarily slow, by the way. I can make this process be a very slow process by playing with that parameter theta. So it can take a long time for this guy to actually start facing any again this project crisis. Now, we can compare that temporary, an example of something that's temporary, with something that is a bit more permanent, which will be a switch on what? Okay, so now we have to think about what's a permanent reform here. So obviously the underlying cause of the distortions in this model is both the limited commitment, which in principle we can think we cannot really fix, and this political parameter that may be the outcome of some political process that could be change. So let's think about, for example, a change in theta. That's a reduction in that disagreement parameter that we have at the beginning. So what that does in this model is just changes the slope of that line, pushes it down. And now the economy, rather than kind of having an effect that temporarily goes away, actually might even save and reach a steady state where distortions are smaller and investment is higher. Okay? So that would be something temporary, as long as we cannot reverse back this constitutional change that induced the change in theta. Well, this type of reform will be something that will persist and last for a long time. Okay, so that one, I was trying to think about ways in which I could conceptualize the ideas that were in the paper, and I think this kind of goes along the way of thinking about something that is transitory versus something that is permanent. So what is, so the story I just highlighted here, it kind of emphasizes the link between debt and inefficiencies and the fact that this is a political trade-off. It's not something that is given, so people are choosing how much to borrow, and these decisions have effects on future governments in the policies that they choose as well. So, and kind of the bottom line here, that countries with more political disagreement end up with more debt and more distortion, but there is a bunch of stuff that they have time to think through, and actually thought they would be interesting to add to the story, but I didn't know how to put them in, which, for example, why is exactly the role of a stand-on enterprise, how it shows up in the budget constraint. Then you have to think also, as Tom was pointing at this, what's the difference between something on equilibrium and these off-equilibrium payrolls that are associated with that asset. Pension funds is similar. Obviously, a bigger story in this analysis is the possibility of default and this associated cost. I don't have any of that in that simple model, but introducing shocks and uncertainty would be the way to go there. Then finally, obviously, the model doesn't have any monetary thing, so there's no inflation, but one can think of introducing inflation as an alternative policy tool and kind of consider that as well. So some final comments on this topic. I think the big question is, how do we make a change in the political game that gets sustained over time? The authors actually discuss what they call the strong executive. I mean, that sounds reasonable. If you look at the evidence they present, that's actually kind of about rights. You know, some of these reforms were implemented by very strong governments. Some of them weren't. But I mean, I'm always a bit dubious about this because what if we get a crazy guy? It's good that you have a strong government as long as you don't get Fidel Castro elected. But if you got Fidel Castro elected, then having a strong government was not really a great thing. So you know, where do we draw the line? And then why actually that, what is it exactly in the nature of what they did? Not only that they were strong and powerful, but what made that actually long-lasting, persistent. I think actually something that I learned from Paco in their Econometrica paper, that there is a lot to be said about learning from others. So these countries are not in isolation, obviously. So Chile is a typical example. A bunch of the neighbors learned from what Chile did, and they implemented policies that reflected the success that they saw Chile was obtaining by their reforms. So it would be nice to understand maybe the experiences of these countries through the light of that learning story, together with shocks and temporary reversals that happen just because of business cycles or because of outside influences. And yeah, so this is doesn't make, I don't have time to spend a second bullet at the end, so that's just going to conclude. So I think it's a very interesting question. It's a lot of information in the documents that Tom and Saki sent me, and I'm looking forward to learn more about the topic.